In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you why Halberds are the best weapon in Elden Ring. This is the 7th video in our series where we dissect all the weapons in a given weapon category, go through their pros and cons, and show you why you may or may not use them in your build. Before that, however, I want to talk about the pros and cons of this weapon class in general, and the styles of play that most players are likely to use when using these weapons. The pros of this weapon type are that they typically have longer reach than most other weapons. They tend to make enemies flinch when you hit with them, allowing you to hit repeatedly without getting attacked in a lot of cases, and they usually have pretty high attack rating for the weight that they are. The downsides of this weapon class are that they tend to attack slower than a lot of other weapon classes in the game, and their block counters are much slower than some others. The styles of play available to this weapon class are also a lot wider in my opinion than maybe some other classes. You'll probably see people using all different styles. You'll see people dual wielding them in jump attacks, people using single halberds leaning into the weapon skill. You use people hybriding into some sort of spellcasting build using the Dragon Communion Seal in a lot of cases, or the Claw Mark Seal. And you might even see people using a Great Shield and using one in one hand, doing block counters and leaning into the fast R1 attacks of some of the halberds that can be used. I think this is one of the more unique thing about halberds is that they have so many variances from halberd to halberd in terms of what their R1 attack is, what their R2 attack is, what their strengths and weaknesses are, that it's hard to categorize all these weapons together into one thing. But as I mentioned earlier, there are some pros and cons, but this class has like a wider variance than maybe some other weapon types. So let's jump into the unique halberds first, and first up is the Gargoyle's Black Halberd. The Gargoyle's Black Halberd shares the default moveset of most halberds and deals physical and holy damage. It has a heavy weight for a halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 12, and requires a lot of points in strength and faith and some points in dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it has very high attack rating, which will continue to increase into NG+ and beyond. It has 715 attack rating approximately at minimum requirements, which is extremely high. It's dropped by the Blackblade Kindred, which isn't too far into the game in Caelid compared to some halberds. The cons of this weapon are that it deals a lot of holy damage, which is resisted by many endgame bosses. You cannot change the Ash of War on this weapon, and it has poor scaling, making it better earlier in the game than later. Much like other Gargoyle's Black weapons, the Gargoyle's Black Halberd has exceptional attack rating but very poor scaling, making it much better early on in Elden Ring than later. Additionally, holy damage is resisted by difficult bosses later on in the game, further reinforcing this concept. A big negative of this weapon, besides the holy damage, is that you cannot change the Ash of War spinning slash. And while this is certainly not the worst Ash of War, one charged R2 of this weapon does nearly the same thing. This will result in very situational uses of this Ash of War, though it can be used a bit faster than a charged R2. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 50 strength, 50 faith, and 50 dexterity, though the faith and dexterity scaling is rather poor with this weapon. However, this gives the weapon very high attack rating and one that can continue to increase through NG+ and NG++, making it a decent option for successive playthroughs. Because this is a strength faith weapon primarily, it makes a great candidate for the Claw Mark Seal to cast incantations when not two-handing it, so consider using this if you use this weapon. Another option is using it with a Great Shield since you have high strength, using block counters if you want. Next up is the Ripple Crescent Halberd. The Ripple Crescent Halberd shares the default moveset of most halberds and deals physical damage. It has a light weight for a halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 8.5, and requires some points in strength, dexterity, and arcane in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it can be buffed with weapon buffs despite being a unique weapon. It has fantastic arcane scaling. It can be found very early on in the game, dropping from Albinarchs and Liurnia of the Lakes, and it has the third longest reach of the halberds in Elden Ring. The negatives of this weapon are that it has low attack rating compared to most other halberds. The Ripple Crescent Halberd is unique because it has 100% arcane scaling, does entirely physical damage, can be buffed with weapon buffs like Electrify Armament or Bloodflame Blade, and has exceptional length, making it easy to hit enemies. However, it has very low attack rating compared to other halberds, even when it's buffed, making it a poor choice for any pure melee style of build. This weapon scales exceptionally well up to 80 arcane, however I don't advise taking it that high early on, and there are a couple reasons for that. First, incantations that buff weapon damage only use the faith stat to determine their damage, so if you use Electrify Armament with little to no faith and all arcane, it will be much less effective. Second, the Dragon Communion Seal soft caps around 45 arcane, so going much higher won't result in much increased performance, and increasing faith will actually outperform arcane past this point. Third, incantations require faith in order to use, so you'll need some faith anyway if you're planning to cast spells when using this weapon, which you should be since the Dragon Communion Seal is perfect for doing this. And finally, you'll actually do more damage by splitting your attributes between Arcane and Faith when you're buffed with Golden Vow and some sort of weapon buff, like Electrify Armament. For this reason, I advise something like 45 Arcane and 45 Faith, and using Dragon Incantations, Golden Vow, and any other weapon incantation buffs or incantations you like. This will give you more attack rating than just going all Arcane, and will provide you with the versatility to use Dragon Incantations effectively. You can also pair it with the Vulgar Militia Saw in your offhand for a jump attack build that can cast spells and sets Hemorrhage rather easily. Next up is the Golden Halberd. The Golden Halberd shares a unique R2 with the Lucerne and Nightrider Glaive that does an overhead strike and deals physical and holy damage. It has the heaviest weight for a halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 13.5, and requires a lot of points in strength and some points in faith and dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it has good strength scaling, it has the highest attack rating of all halberds, which will continue to increase into NG Plus and beyond, and drops extremely early in the game from the Tree Sentinel and Limgrave. The negatives of this weapon are that it's the heaviest halberd in the game, you cannot change the Ash of War Golden Vow, and the skill is less effective than the spell, and it deals a lot of holy damage which is resisted by many endgame bosses. The attack rating of the Golden Halberd is one of the highest in Elden Ring, particularly when you compare it against its weight, which is almost half as light as most weapons that deal the same damage. However, it's sort of in a weird place because you get the most damage from it around 55 strength and 45 faith, which allows you to use the Golden Vow incantation easily because this only requires 25 faith. But this weapon's Ash of War is Golden Vow, and the skill version is actually a little bit less effective than the incantation. This makes the Ash of War a bit redundant once you have the incantation. But what this does allow you to do is make a jump attack halberd build that uses two halberds that can buff mid-combat without having to swap to a Sacred Seal, which can come in handy in aggressive boss situations. I highly recommend using the Gargoyle's Black Halberd in your offhand if you do this, because it has similar scaling damage and damage types. Much like the Gargoyle's Black Halberd, the Golden Halberd makes a good candidate for the Clawmark Seal since you'll have high strength and faith, and this allows you to play a hybrid build using this weapon naturally. You can also use a Great Shield with this setup if you wish, using a good Ash of War on the shield instead, like Barricade Shield, Crashing Shield, or Holy Ground. This sort of allows you to mask the Golden Halberd's weakness, which is its Golden Vow Ash. And since you have solid strength scaling, you can increase the damage of this weapon into NG Plus and beyond very well, making it a great choice for successive playthroughs. Next up, we have the Dragon Halberd. The Dragon Halberd thrusts with its R1 attack instead of slashing, much like the Halberd, Banished Knight's Halberd, and Commander's standard weapons, and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 10.5, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that Spinning Slash buffs the weapon with Ice Lightning for 20 seconds, adding 130 lightning damage and 80 frost buildup. It has very high attack rating when buffed with Ice Lightning. It can be found relatively early on in Elden Ring by defeating the Dragonkin Soldier in Siofra River. Quality scaling allows it to be very effective in NG Plus and beyond. And finally, you can use the Spear Talisman effectively due to thrusting R1 attacks. The negatives of this weapon are that it has average attack rating when not buffed when compared with other halberds. It's one of the shortest halberds in the game, and the R1 attacks can often miss off to the right of the enemy quite easily if they're even slightly mobile. The Dragon Halberd is an interesting weapon because it doesn't seem that great at first glance. It has a relatively low attack rating for a halberd, you cannot change the Ash of War Spinning Slash, and you cannot apply weapon buffs to this weapon like Grease or Lightning Armament. However, because Spinning Slash buffs the weapon itself, it becomes much more potent after using this. This catapults the Dragon Halberd to near top of the list of halberds in terms of total attack rating while buffed, and it has very solid scaling to boot, allowing it to catch up or surpass many other halberds in NG Plus and beyond. Additionally, when compared to the Dragon Scale Blade, which also has this buff, Spinning Slash is much easier to use and is likely something you'd use regularly anyway, making the Dragon Halberd the easier of the two weapons to trigger Ice Lightning. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 55 strength and 45 dexterity, despite the B scaling in strength and C in dexterity. This makes this weapon more of a quality scaling weapon than strength, opening up the door for even more damage at higher levels, as I just mentioned. I would personally pair this weapon with another cold-infused halberd for a jump attack style build, or simply two-handed, leaning it into the Ash of War that you'll have to use frequently in order to keep your weapon buffed. Make sure to use the Spear Talisman if you aren't using a jump attack build to take advantage of the thrusting R1 attacks, increasing your overall damage. The next unique halberd is Loretta's War Sickle. Loretta's War Sickle shares a unique R1 with the Guardian Swordspear that has angled swings that are quite fast and deals physical and magic damage. It has an average weight for a halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 10, and requires some points in strength, intelligence, and dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it has decent strength and dexterity scaling, making it a good choice for NG+. It's the second longest halberd in Elden Ring. R1s have faster attack speed than all other halberds except Guardian Swordspear, and Loretta's Slash provides hyper armor allowing you to tank through hits. The negatives of this weapon are that it's located near the very end of the game, essentially making this a New Game Plus weapon. Loretta's Slash doesn't do as much damage with this weapon as with other halberds that use the Ash of War and Magic Affinity. And finally, Loretta's Slash doesn't do that much damage in general, and it can be hard to land both hits. Loretta's War Sickle is in a bit of a pickle, because its weapon skill Loretta's Slash is also an Ash of War that is more optimized on other infusible halberds set to the magic or cold affinities, where it will hit for much more damage. It also doesn't have the highest attack rating for a halberd, being in the middle of the pack, making players wonder why you might use it. However, it has exceptional reach, being the second longest halberd, and attacks very quickly using the same moveset as the Guardian Swordspear. This allows you to get off more attacks than most halberds in the same space of time, and make use of talismans that reward you for attacking quickly, like Millicent's Prosthesis or Winged Sword Insignia. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 45 strength, 55 dexterity, and 20 intelligence. Both strength and dexterity have similar scaling, with dexterity slightly edging it out, and intelligence lagging behind. Because of this, I don't recommend using this weapon in a Spellblade sort of build, particularly because you cannot buff this weapon, and instead suggest taking the quality route that I've done here. The damage on this weapon will continue to increase throughout NG Plus and on into NG++, and I advise simply using this weapon two-handed, or with a Great Shield where you can block counter and still use the fast R1 attacks effectively. You might even want to put an Ash of War on your shield, since Loretta's Slash won't be as optimized as it could be with other halberds. Two other things that I forgot to mention that this weapon type is really good for are mounted combat and quality scaling. This weapon type has one of the best mounted combat movesets in the game because its weapon attacks almost out in like a 30 to 45 degree angle, which tends to hit anything to the sides of you rather easily, and it attacks much faster than some weapons like great swords or whatever on horseback, so you can get a lot of damage out, you connect more regularly, and you can swing faster. And when it comes to the quality scaling, it's one of the weapons in the game that will actually surpass heavier keen scaling, with just about every single weapon in this class that can be infused with quality scaling at some point in NG Plus or beyond when you reach about 60 or so strength and dexterity, making it really, really good for successive playthroughs. And this brings us to the last unique halberd, Commander's Standard. The Commander's Standard thrusts with its R1 attack instead of slashing, much like the Halberd, Banished Knight's Halberd, and Dragon Halberd, and deals physical damage. It has a heavy weight for a halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 11.5, and requires a lot of points in strength and some in dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that Rallying Standard allows you to buff your damage and defenses by 20% without any investment in faith. It's the longest halberd in Elden Ring, and you can use the Spear Talisman effectively due to thrusting R1 attacks, and is found relatively early in Elden Ring by defeating Commander O'Neill in the Aeonia Swamp in Caelid. The negatives of this weapon are that Rallying Standard only lasts 30 seconds and has a long animation, making it difficult to rebuff with mid-combat. Rallying Standard is quite expensive at 30 FP for a 30-second buff, and finally it has lower attack rating than most other unique halberds, and even some infusible halberds when not buffed. When buffed, the Commander's Standard is in the middle of the pack in terms of attack rating, but when unbuffed, it's near the bottom. Because Rallying Standard has such a long animation and short duration, it can be tedious to use while already engaged in combat since you risk being struck when using it. And unlike the Dragon Halberd, you don't do any damage when casting it, so you can't buff and attack at the same time. However, it does have the longest range of all halberds in Elden Ring, and its R1 attack is a thrust, which allows you to take advantage of the Spear Talisman for increased damage. The sweet spot for this weapon is around 50 strength, but you can go up to 80 effectively, and the dexterity scaling is not as bad as it may appear. This weapon is NG plus effective, but likely not much further than that since you won't be able to get much more damage out of this weapon past 80 strength and 50 dexterity. If you plan to use this weapon, I recommend a jump attack playstyle with this weapon in your right hand to use the buff easily, and make sure to use the Carrion Filigree Crest to reduce the cost of this weapon skill by 25%, or you will struggle with FP management issues. Or use it with a Great Shield since you already have very high strength, and become a tanky god that has incredibly long block counter range, and can make most enemies flinch with regular R1 attacks. That wraps up the unique halberds, and now let's move on to the infusible ones. First up is the Halberd. The Halberd thrusts with its R1 attack instead of slashing, much like the Banished Knight's Halberd, Dragon Halberd, and Commander's Standard, and deals physical damage. It has a light weight for a halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 8, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it's found extremely early on in the game from the Nomadic Merchant and North Limgrave, or after you start with a Vagabond class. It has very light weight for a halberd, and the R1 attack does pierce damage, allowing you to use the Spear Talisman. The negatives are that it has lower attack rating than most other halberds. The main reason to use this weapon is because it can be found so early on in Elden Ring, and the R1 thrust allows you to boost your damage with the Spear Talisman, which wouldn't normally apply to most halberd attacks. It's also one of 2 halberds with this R1 attack that can be outfitted with different Ashes of War, and it has better heavy scaling than the Banished Knight's halberd, which is the other. I'd only suggest using this weapon if you intend to use it two-handed with heavy scaling and you really like the thrusting R1 attack. Another thing I'd recommend is splitting your attributes between Strength and Faith, which would allow you to take advantage of the good heavy scaling and still buff the weapon rather well with incantations like Electrify Armament. The Clawmark Seal would also allow you to cast incantations effectively since it scales off both these attributes. Additionally, using Ashes of War that attack rapidly with talismans like Winged Sword Insignia will produce very high damage because of the high attack rating of these weapons. I wouldn't recommend this weapon in NG+, unless you go the Strength Faith route, since you'll cap out on most of your damage around the end of your first playthrough if you go pure Strength, and Banished Knight's Halberd has better quality scaling and the same moveset if you don't want to go the Faith route. Next up is the Banished Knight's Halberd. The Banished Knight's Halberd thrusts with its R1 attack instead of slashing, much like the Halberd, Dragon Halberd, and Commander's Standard, and deals physical damage. It has a light weight for a Halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 8, and requires some points in Strength and Dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it can be found relatively early on in Elden Ring, dropping from Banished Knights who wield this weapon in Stormveil Castle. It outperforms the Halberd with just about every infusion and has the same moveset. It's one of the longer Halberds in Elden Ring. It's very lightweight for a Halberd, and the R1 attack does pierce damage, allowing for the use of the Spear Talisman effectively. The negative of this weapon is that it's in the bottom half of Halberd attack rating with most infusions. The Banished Knight's Halberd is an upgrade over the Halberd in nearly every way. It's longer, it has higher attack rating in just about every case, but it loses out when compared to the Halberd's heavy scaling. If you like the thrusting moveset of the Halberd, but you aren't using the heavy infusion, or you just want a longer Halberd and want to keep the freedom to use various Ashes of War, then the Banished Knight's Halberd is a good choice. The best infusions for this weapon are Fire, Lightning, and Heavy, with quality outperforming Heavy and NG+, when you approach 58 or so in both Strength and Dexterity. I suggest either using this weapon alone or using it in a jump attack style build. Next up is the Lucerne. The Lucerne shares a unique R2 with the Golden Halberd and Nightrider Glaive that does an overhead strike and deals physical damage. It has the lightest weight for a Halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 7, and requires some points in Strength and Dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it can be found relatively early on in Loretta of the Lakes. It's the lightest Halberd in Elden Ring, and it does chip damage through the block of an enemy. The negatives of this weapon are that it's one of the shortest Halberds in Elden Ring, and has the lowest attack rating of all Halberds with most infusions. While the chip damage of this weapon deals through the block of an enemy is useful in some cases in PvE, most enemies lower their guard often enough to attack you, or you can get the drop on them with a weapon skill before they see you. This makes it hard to justify using this weapon, particularly when you sacrifice 100 or more attack rating versus just about every other Halberd. This weapon could come in handy in PvP where some opponents block, allowing you to deal damage anyway, slowly chipping away at their health and making them reevaluate their strategy. However, the Vulgar Militia Shotel has much the same function, deals much more damage, and is only very slightly shorter, making it hard to justify this weapon unless you really like the unique R2 moveset. Also, Determination and Royal Knight's Resolve make a great choice with this weapon, because even more damage can get through a shield this way. Much like the Banished Knight's Halberd, Fire and Lightning take the top spots with Heavy not far behind, and Quality pulling ahead in NG+, when you approach 60 or so in both Strength and Dexterity. Cold is also not a bad option during your first playthrough, since it has nearly the same damage as Heavy, and also applies Frostbite to the enemy. Next up is the Glaive. The Glaive shares the default moveset of most Halberds and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a Halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 10, and requires some points in Strength and Dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it can be found relatively early on in the game, dropping from a skeleton near the Church of Vows in Loretta of the Lakes. It has higher attack rating than most other Halberds, and has longer reach than most other Halberds. The downside is that it can take a while to farm. The Glaive is a great all-around Halberd. It has relatively high damage when compared with other infusible Halberds. It has fairly good length, being longer than most other Halberds, and the quality scaling on it is exceptional in NG+. However, there is nothing really unique about its moveset or range, making it a good candidate for a jump attack build that doesn't consider these aspects as much, or for a build that just focuses on a particular Ash of War, as this removes the need for a good moveset. It's also not a bad candidate for a hybrid incantation build, much like the Halberd, since it has exceptional strength scaling. The next weapon is the Vulgar Militia Shotel. The Vulgar Militia Shotel shares the default moveset of most Halberds and deals physical damage. It has a light weight for a Halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 8, and requires some points in Strength and Dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it's located not too far into the game, dropping from the enemies wielding this near Bestial Sanctum and Caleb. It's one of the lightest halberds, and attacks deal chip damage through blocks and shields. The negative is that it's one of the shortest halberds in the game. Much like the Lucerne, the major star of this weapon is its ability to go through the guard of an enemy and deal some damage. However, very few enemies in Elden Ring block, making this weapon much more PvP-centric than many others in the game. And that not only deals much more damage than the Lucerne, but you can farm 2 of them, allowing you to jump attack effectively through shields as well. Fire and lightning are both great candidates for this weapon, and cold is also a great option since it still retains B scaling and dexterity when using this infusion, and blood retains A scaling and dexterity. And just like other halberds, quality scaling will catch heavy at some point in NG+, or NG++, with enough strength and dexterity, so make sure you swap this if you're going the all-physical route. Next we have the Vulgar Militia Saw. The Vulgar Militia Saw shares the default moveset of most halberds and deals physical damage. It has a light weight for a halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 8, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it's the only halberd that deals bleed buildup on a hit natively. It's located not too far into the game, dropping from the enemies wielding this near Bestial Sanctum and Caleb, and you can farm 2 of them. The con of this weapon is that it's the second shortest halberd in Elden Ring. The Vulgar Militia Saw is the only halberd that has native bleed buildup on it, making it the best option for a status effect build if you want to use a halberd for 1, particularly because you can use 2 if you want. The damage on this weapon is also around the middle of the pack halberd-wise, meaning you don't lose out on that much damage to pick up the bleed, which is great. I'd either use 2 of these in a jump attack sort of build that focuses on status effects, or lean into an Ash of War that can hit repeatedly like blood tax, repeating thrusts, or double slash. You can stack dual statuses with either cold or poison, or commit fully to bleeding with the occult infusion. If you go occult, I highly recommend hybriding into casting using the Dragon Communion Seal, and pairing it with the Ripple Crescent Halberd in the main hand because you can buff this with the Bloodflame Blade incantation. Next up is Guardian Swordspear. The Guardian Swordspear shares a unique R1 with Loretta's War Sickle that has angled swings that are quite fast and deals physical damage. It has an average weight for a halberd in Elden Ring weighing 9 and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it has exceptionally high dexterity scaling and attack rating when set to key. It has very fast R1 attacks that hit faster than all other halberds besides Loretta's War Sickle. It can be farmed somewhat early in the game in Caleb, and you can farm 2 of them. The Guardian Swordspear is arguably the best all-around infusible halberd in Elden Ring. It's near the top in terms of attack rating, it's in the middle of the pack when it comes to range, and its attack speed is second to none. Additionally, it looks fucking awesome. But what really makes this weapon stand out is its insane keen attack rating and dexterity scaling when set to keen. Dexterity scaling plays a part in some Ashes of War, like Thunderbolt for example, making the Guardian Swordspear perfect for these weapon skills. Another thing that makes this halberd particularly strong is that it still has incredibly high damage one-handed, allowing you to use a shield or seal in the offhand without sacrificing hardly any damage. You can pair this with the Jellyfish Shield for very high damage R1 attacks, or buff with Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength, or both, for some of the fastest damaging R1 attacks in all of Elden Ring. This weapon works very well in that scenario and allows it to remain strong into NG+ and beyond. You can also make a jump attack build with 2 of these if you want, but I personally feel that its fast R1 attacks are the shining star. Next up is the Gargoyle's Halberd. The Gargoyle's Halberd shares the default moveset of most halberds and deals physical damage. It has a heavy weight for a halberd in Elden Ring weighing 12 and requires a lot of points in strength and some in dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it's pretty much tied for the highest attack rating of all infusible halberds with the Nightrider Glaive. The cons are that it's one of the heaviest halberds in Elden Ring, it's the shortest reach of all halberds, and it's found further into the game than most halberds, dropping from the Gargoyle and Lindell Royal Capital. This halberd is pretty much tied with the Nightrider Glaive for the most damage at every infusion, slightly beating it out in the heavy infusion department. However, it is the shortest halberd in Elden Ring, and the Nightrider Glaive is much longer and can be acquired a bit sooner. Really, the best reason to use the Gargoyle's Halberd is because it does standard damage while the Nightrider Glaive does slash. Not all enemies that are resistant to slash damage are resistant to standard damage, like Banished Knights for example. So it's not a bad idea to have both of these weapons if you go this route, so that you can swap between them if an enemy is weak or resistant to one of these types. If you're going to use the Gargoyle's Halberd, you want to either use the fire, heavy, or cold infusions in order to take advantage of these infusions' strength scaling. If you go the heavy route, I'd suggest using a Strength Faith build using the Clawmark Sealed, since you come out with about the same amount of damage when buffed, and it gives you the flexibility of incantations. It also future-proofs your build into NG+, since pure strength will cap out near the end of your first playthrough in terms of damage. Next we have the Nightrider Glaive. The Nightrider Glaive shares a unique R2 with the Golden Halberd and Lucerne that does an overhead strike. It has a heavy weight for a halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 12, and requires a lot of points in strength and summon dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it's pretty much tied for the highest attack rating of all infusible halberds with the Gargoyle's Halberd. It drops somewhat early in the game from the Knight's Cavalry in Liurnia of the Lakes, and it's the 4th longest halberd in Elden Ring. The negative is that it's one of the heaviest halberds in Elden Ring. As I just mentioned, the Nightrider Glaive has many advantages over the Gargoyle's Halberd and also has exceptional strength scaling despite being slightly lower. I'd play this weapon in a similar manner, leaning into the strong strength scaling to get the most out of it. Again, hybriding with Faith allows you to take this build into NG Plus and beyond much more easily, and is highly recommended if you plan to continue past your first playthrough. Also note that its R2 attack is not an AoE sweep like the Gargoyle's Halberd, but instead an overhead smash that deals really good single target damage. This makes this weapon strangely better at single enemies, even though it's much longer than the Gargoyle's Halberd. And lastly, we have the Pest Glaive. The Pest Glaive shares the default moveset of many halberds and deals physical damage. It has the lightest weight for a halberd in Elden Ring, weighing 7, and requires some points in strength and dexterity in order to wield. The pros of this weapon are that it's the lightest halberd in Elden Ring, and it's located not too far into the game, dropping from Pests and Caelid. The negatives are that it's the 2nd lowest attack rating of all halberds, and it's one of the shorter halberds in Elden Ring. The Pest Glaive has very low attack rating compared with other halberds in Elden Ring, though it does have decent keen and occult scaling. It also doesn't have particularly good reach, making it less than optimal for almost every build you would make with a halberd. My advice would be, if you want to use this weapon, go occult and slap seppuku on it, and try to proc bleed as often as you can with normal attacks, triggering Lord of Blood's Exaltation and White Mask for higher attack rating. Well, that wraps up our video on halberds. What did you guys think of the video? Are there other tips you guys have about halberds? Did I miss anything? Let us know in the comments below.